The morning of the 26th of April, 1478, broke with the sound of church bells echoing through the marble heart of Florence. Sunlight spilled through the stained glass of Santa Maria del Fiore, painting the congregation in fragments of crimson and gold. Inside, the air was thick with incense and expectation. The entire city's elite had gathered for high mass merchants, nobles, ambassadors, all under the vast dome designed by Brunelleschi. Among them stood two brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, heirs to Florence's most powerful dynasty. Their presence drew whispers of reverence and resentment in equal measure. The Medici Bank had financed kings and popes alike. Their fortune built the very cathedrals where their names were now being praised. To some, they were patrons of art and faith. To others, they were usurpers' men who had replaced God's order with the quiet tyranny of money. As the choir began the Gloria, a man in the front pew crossed himself, but his fingers trembled. He wasn't praying. Hidden beneath his sleeve, a dagger gleamed, its blade glinting in the holy light. Behind him, others waited for the signal. The plot had been weeks in the making, whispered through cloisters and palaces, sealed with the promise of papal forgiveness and Florentine gold. When the priest lifted the host, the holiest moment of the Mass, the sanctuary erupted in screams. Francesco de' Pazzi lunged first. Giuliano staggered backward, his white tunic exploding with red. 19 thrusts in the chest, delivered in frenzy, turned the marble floor into a pool of blood. Lorenzo spun, his face slashed, his hands slick with his brother's life. He tore off his cape and slammed the door of the sacristy shut, barricading himself inside as chaos engulfed the cathedral. Outside, bells tolled not for worship, but for war. The congregation fled in panic. Soldiers stormed the streets. Within hours, the Medici banners rose again, bloodstained and triumphant. But this was no victory of faith. It was the birth of a curse. Florence had drawn its first breath as a city of beauty and intellect, a beacon of the Renaissance. That day, it exhaled something different, the stench of vengeance, the price of ambition, the scent of a pact sealed not in ink, but in blood. The massacre inside the cathedral was only the beginning, for behind that moment lay a secret agreement, one that bound Florence's destiny to gold, to the church, and to death itself. A covenant between bankers and bishops, between power and salvation. The question that still haunts history is not who wielded the dagger, but who truly ordered it. And more haunting still, asterisk, what did Florence trade away in exchange for its soul? Asterisk. Before blood stained the altar of Florence, the Medici name shimmered like divine light across Italy. Theirs was the family that transformed gold into power, power into influence, and influence into legend. To the world, they were the architects of beauty, the patrons who had resurrected a forgotten city and turned it into the beating heart of the Renaissance. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as times Lorenzo the Magnificent Asterisk, was the very embodiment of this illusion. His Florence seemed a paradise of intellect and grace. Poets recited verses in candlelit halls, sculptors chiseled gods out of marble, and painters revealed heaven on canvas. Botticelli painted The Birth of Venus under Lorenzo's protection. Young Michelangelo was nurtured within his palace walls. Music, laughter, and philosophy filled the courtyards where once the cries of rebellion had echoed. Florence, under Medici rule, looked like a miracle, the living dream of human genius. But every miracle in Florence came with a ledger. The Medici Bank was the engine behind this splendor, a web of accounts stretching from London to Rome, Venice to Bruges. It lent money to monarchs and popes, to armies and emperors. Yet beneath the polished surface of commerce, Lorenzo's Florence was quietly suffocating under debt and control. Loans were granted not just in coin, but in loyalty. Artists, officials, even bishops owed their careers to the Medici signature. To defy them was to risk ruin. To oppose them was to risk death. The Pazzi family, ancient, proud, and wealthy, knew this too well. Once competitors in banking, they were slowly strangled by the Medici monopoly. Even the church had become part of the Medici machine. Pope Sixtus IV, desperate for credit, borrowed heavily from Lorenzo's bank. When Lorenzo refused to fund the Pope's military ambitions, a dangerous alliance began to take shape, one that would twist faith into conspiracy. The Vatican turned to the Pazzi. In exchange for support, the family would help the papacy break the Medici's grip on Florence. The arrangement was more than politics. It was heresy disguised as piety, the trading of divine favor for worldly dominance, and as gold crossed the Alps, whispers of betrayal began to poison the air of Florence. Still, to the citizens, Lorenzo remained their Prince of Peace, the poet king whose charm could tame wars and inspire love. Statues were raised in his honor, verses immortalized his name, but as the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore rang each morning, few realized that they were tolling not for glory, but for debt, and that the city's beauty was being purchased, piece by piece, with its freedom. Behind the Renaissance facade stood a darker truth. Florence was no longer a republic of the people, but a kingdom of one family. And the day would come in blood and betrayal when that illusion would shatter under the echo of the cathedral bells. For behind the splendor of art and faith, a storm was already gathering, and the price of this golden age would soon be paid in crimson. Behind every masterpiece that adorned Florence, behind every hymn sung in its cathedrals, there existed a silent mechanism precise, relentless, and merciless. It was not carved in marble nor painted on frescoes, but etched into ledgers, contracts, and debts. This was the true engine of the Medici dynasty, the banking machine that turned faith into currency and salvation into profit. The Medici Bank was no ordinary institution. Founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, perfected by his son Cosimo, and inherited by Lorenzo, it stretched across Europe like a nervous system of gold. From Bruges to Rome, from Geneva to London, its agents collected, counted, and controlled the wealth of nations. Even the Vatican's own treasury beat to its rhythm. The Pope prayed beneath frescoes financed by Medici credit. Every indulgence sold, every crusade funded, every relic adorned in gold, the bank's ink sealed it all. But under Lorenzo's reign, that system evolved from mere finance into domination. The bank became a weapon. Loans were extended to nobles and bishops, not to enrich them, but to bind them. When a prince borrowed from the Medici, he did not simply owe money, he owed allegiance. When a bishop borrowed, he offered not just interest, but influence over the pulpit. And when the church itself borrowed, Florence became God's banker. This was the covenant of power Lorenzo inherited, a pact not written in blood yet enforced by it. For every account that fell behind, there was a punishment. Trade routes were cut, businesses ruined, reputations destroyed. Lorenzo mastered the art of conquest without armies. His soldiers were accountants, his battlefield was the marketplace. And while his city flourished with the illusion of freedom, its people were bound in invisible chains of obligation. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing a generation later, would describe Lorenzo as a man whose intellect ruled where armies could not. In the shadows of Florence, his words proved true. The Medici had learned that power was not taken, it was bought. Yet no machine of domination runs forever without resistance. The cracks began with the Pazzi, but they spread through the courts of Europe, through the Vatican's own corridors. When Pope Sixtus IV realized that the Medici controlled not only Florence's treasury, but also its faith, he saw an empire greater than his own. The Holy See could not tolerate a family that treated the church like a client. Thus, plans were drawn in candlelight and sealed with oaths sworn before crucifixes. The Pope's nephews, Francesco Salviati, and the ambitious Pazzi brothers pledged to end Medici rule by blade, if not by prayer. Letters between Rome and Florence carried coded instructions. Spies infiltrated Lorenzo's inner circle. Even the Archbishop of Pisa agreed to sanctify the conspiracy, believing that by killing 2 men, he would restore divine order. But the irony was cruel. In seeking to destroy the Medici, the conspirators only completed their design. The murder they plotted inside the cathedral, a holy space turned killing ground, was not a rebellion against tyranny. It was proof of how deeply the Medici machine had corrupted even faith itself. That morning, when daggers rose beneath the dome of God, the bankers and the priests became indistinguishable. The act that was meant to save Florence only consecrated its damnation. The massacre inside Santa Maria del Fiore was over in moments, but its echo thundered across Florence for generations. When Lorenzo de' Medici stepped out from the sacristy, blood drying on his neck, the city was no longer the same. The Republic trembled not because its ruler had almost been slain, but because it had just witnessed what happened when anyone dared to touch him. Before the candles on the altar had even gone cold, Lorenzo's vengeance began. The bells of the Palazzo Vecchio rang out, not for mourning, but for judgment. The Pazzi conspirators, once draped in silk, were dragged through the cobbled streets barefoot, beaten, and spat upon. Francesco de' Pazzi was hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. his corpse twisting above the very crowd that had once bowed before him. Archbishop Salviati, the Pope's own envoy, shared the same fate, his lifeless body swinging beside the Pazzi crest, a symbol of Florence's defiance against Rome. In a single day, more than *80 men were executed, some by sword, some by rope. Others vanished into the dungeons beneath the Palazzo Pitti, their screams muffled by stone. Houses bearing the Pazzi name were burned to the ground. Their family tombs were desecrated. Every public record of their existence was erased. Even their coat of arms, once carved into cathedrals, was chiseled off and replaced with the Medici emblem. Lorenzo had turned grief into policy. The act of revenge became an act of governance. The city itself was transformed into a stage for his power. Statues were commissioned to glorify justice, his justice. Artists painted allegories of treachery punished by divine wrath, their brushstrokes dripping with propaganda. To the people of Florence, these images were not art, they were warnings. To betray the Medici was to invite the fate of the Pazzi humiliation before death and oblivion after it. And yet, outside Florence's walls, the consequences grew darker still. Pope Sixtus IV, enraged by the death of his archbishop, excommunicated Lorenzo and the entire city. Florence, once the cradle of the Renaissance, found itself cursed by the church. The papal armies marched from the south, joined by the King of Naples. War threatened to consume Tuscany, but Lorenzo, ever the diplomat, turned war into opportunity. He sailed unarmed to Naples, walked into the court of his enemies, and emerged weeks later with peace. Historians would call it a miracle of statesmanship. His followers called it divine favor. But those who saw the truth knew he had paid the price of peace in coin and in souls. Florence was spared, yet it became a city built on obedience and fear. By the time the war ended, Lorenzo was no longer just the ruler of Florence. He was its savior, its redeemer, its silent tyrant. The people wept for him as they once wept for saints, forgetting that it was his hands that had signed the orders for slaughter. From the cathedral to the palace, from the Vatican to the battlefield, the message was the same. Beauty could be reborn only through blood. Florence had bought its survival, but the currency it used was its conscience. The Renaissance was no longer a rebirth of the soul, it was a transaction. Centuries later, the marble crypts beneath Florence still whisper of that day. Dust settles on the gilded tombs of the Medici, but time cannot erase the silence of their secrets. In 2012, researchers entered those tombs with the tools of modern science. They unsealed the coffins of princes and popes, seeking to read in bone and dust what chronicles had dared not speak. Within the remains of certain Medici descendants, they found traces of mercury, a substance used both as medicine and as poison. It was not proof of murder, but it was a reminder that even in death, the family's power was a double-edged gift. The very hands that financed miracles had also written obituaries. Lorenzo's own life ended in relative peace in 1492, the same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, but his peace was deceptive. Florence had become the model of a Renaissance state, beautiful, devout, prosperous, and utterly controlled. Generations later, Machiavelli would write Times, The Prince Asterisk, a treatise many believe inspired by Lorenzo's life. In it, he observed that power must often be preserved by fear, and that mercy is useful only when it serves authority. The philosophy of Florence's golden age had been reduced to arithmetic, the calculation of survival. Yet within that darkness, one story continues to humanize the myth. A letter written by a Florentine witness weeks after the Pazzi Conspiracy describes the return of Giuliano's body to Santa Croce for burial. The writer recounts how Lorenzo stood beside his brother's coffin, face pale, unmoving, as the choir sang a hymn of resurrection. When the final note faded, Lorenzo touched Giuliano's blood-stained tunic and whispered asterisk. He has not died for nothing. Asterisk. Those words became his private vow to rule Florence so completely that no one would ever again dare to strike a Medici. And he did. Lorenzo's children and grandchildren would ascend to positions beyond imagination. Giovanni would become Pope Leo X, and Giulio would become Pope Clement VII. Catherine de' Medici would one day rule France as queen. Through marriage, wealth, and the patronage of art, the family rewrote its own sins into scripture. Churches once desecrated by vengeance now bore frescoes of angels painted in their honor. The Medici had purchased eternity. But modern science archaeology, and history keep tugging at the edges of that perfection. CT scans reveal malformations caused by disease, dental abscesses that spread infection to the brain, reminders of mortality. Chemical analysis uncovers traces of toxins, suggesting that even inside the Medici palace, fear of betrayal lingered in every cup. The family that ruled by manipulation had been poisoned by its own distrust. Florence's beauty, the Duomo, the Uffizi, the frescoes, stands today as testimony to their vision. Yet in the catacombs beneath, the bones tell another story, of a city that traded purity for permanence, and of a dynasty that embalmed its name in gold, even as it rotted from within. The Renaissance is remembered as humanity's rebirth. But if you listen closely beneath the streets of Florence, beneath the echo of tour guides and the footsteps of scholars, you can almost hear another sound, the faint drip of blood that once consecrated a city's soul. When night falls over Florence, the city glows with the soft reflection of its own legend. The Duomo rises like a memory of perfection, and the Arno carries the whispers of 5 centuries of history. Tourists walk its streets in awe, unaware that beneath every marble arch lies a choice, one that once decided whether Florence would live in light or drown in shadow. The Medici legacy endures in stone, in color, in music. Their fingerprints rest on the Renaissance itself. They gave humanity Michelangelo's David, Botticelli's Venus, and Brunelleschi's dome that still defies gravity. Yet the question remains, what price was paid for this beauty? What blood soaked the soil beneath these masterpieces? History often remembers the Medici as the patrons who civilized power through art. But what it forgets or chooses to ignore is that art was their absolution. Every chapel fresco, every commissioned symphony, every sculpture carved from marble was a confession, an attempt to paint over the sins that money has sanctified. They turned faith into finance, forgiveness into transaction. They purchased not only art but redemption, rewriting morality in the language of gold. Florence's so-called rebirth was, in truth, an act of surrender. It surrendered freedom for prosperity, democracy for spectacle, conscience for comfort, and in doing so, it became a mirror of all ages that follow. For what nation, what empire, has not made the same exchange, sacrificing virtue for progress, humanity for greatness? In the archives of Florence, the Times Cronaca Fiorentina, Times records the executions that followed the Pazzi Conspiracy. The entries are brief, written with bureaucratic calm, names, dates, methods of death. There is no mention of regret. Yet between the lines, one can feel it, the pulse of a city that lost its innocence in a single day of blood. Perhaps that is why the story of Lorenzo and the Pazzi still endures. It is not merely a tale of power and betrayal, but a reflection of the oldest truth in human history, that every civilization builds its glory on something buried, whether it be bones, secrets, or souls. 5 centuries have passed, yet the same equation remains. Wealth buys loyalty, fear maintains order, and beauty distracts from corruption. The Medici may be gone, but their method, the perfect fusion of art and control, survives in every system that disguises tyranny as progress. If you walk into the cathedral today, the light still falls the same way it did on that April morning. It floods the marble floor, where blood once shimmered like rubies under the sacred Sunday. Tourists take photos unaware that beneath their feet lies the site where Florence sealed its fate. And somewhere, in the echo of the bells, one might still hear the question that history never answered.